October 3rd, 1978. Just after sunrise, in a stretch of farmland outside Boone County, Iowa, a freight train carrying 32 loaded cars screamed its brakes against cold steel and stopped. Not because of a signal, not because of a failure, but because a single man had parked a faded red Farmall tractor directly across the tracks and refused to move. The engineer leaned out of the cab, furious, shouting down the line, "Who the hell do you think you are?" But the man on the tractor didn't answer. He just sat there, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life. And in a way, he had. Because what stood on those tracks that morning wasn't just a stubborn farmer. It was the last line between a railroad company and a piece of land they thought they could take without a fight. But what nobody understood yet was that Caleb Turner didn't come there to negotiate. He came there to stop something, for good. The Midland rail trucks rolled in less than an hour later, kicking up dust across the dry gravel road. Black sedans followed. Then county deputies. Then a small crowd, neighbors, curious onlookers, a couple of reporters who smelled a story before it even had a name. And at the center of it all, still unmoving, sat that old Farmall. Its paint was chipped, its metal worn thin by decades of sun and wind. It looked like something that should have been retired 20 years earlier, not standing in defiance of a freight line worth millions. Richard Hale stepped out of the lead car, adjusting his coat, as if the dirt itself offended him. He was the kind of man who had never lost an argument in his life. Clean shoes, clean hands, the kind that signed papers and watched things move from a distance. He glanced once at the tractor and smirked. Well, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like we've been stopped by a museum piece." A few people in the crowd laughed. Caleb didn't move, didn't even look at him. Hale walked closer, stopping just a few feet from the tractor's front tire. He studied it like it was something broken, something beneath him. "You Caleb Turner?" he asked. No response. Hale exhaled sharply, then raised his voice. "You're trespassing on company property. This track is scheduled for expansion. You were notified. You had your time." Still nothing. Just that quiet, steady presence, like a rock in the middle of a river. And that silence, it started to bother people. So Hale pushed harder. "You think this," he gestured at the tractor. With a dismissive flick of his hand, "this pile of scrap is going to stop progress." More laughter. Someone muttered, "Old man's lost it." Another voice louder, "That thing probably won't even start." And that was when Hale smiled, because now he had an audience. He turned slightly, making sure the reporters could see his face. "This right here," he said, tapping the tractor's rusted hood, "is exactly what's wrong with places like this. People too stubborn to let go of the past." Then he leaned in, just a little closer. "You're done, Mr. Turner. This land is done. And that toy you're sitting on?" He shook his head. "It's not going to save you." A pause, long enough for the words to settle, for the humiliation to land, for everyone watching to quietly agree. And still, Caleb Turner said nothing. He just looked ahead, past the tracks, past the men, past the noise, like he wasn't even in the same moment as everyone else. But there was something about that stillness, something that didn't feel like defeat. And if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have noticed the way his fingers rested on the wheel. Not tense, not uncertain, but familiar, like a man holding something he understood far better than anyone around him. Because the truth was, this wasn't the first time Caleb Turner had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But to understand why he was sitting there that morning, you have to go back to a time when that land wasn't just property on a map. And that tractor wasn't just an old machine waiting to be laughed at. Back to when everything still had a name, and a purpose, and a cost. Caleb Turner was born in 1936, in a house that no longer stands. His father, Samuel Turner, built it with his own hands just 2 years after returning from the war. Not much more than timber and stubbornness, but it was enough. Enough to raise a family, enough to start something. The land they worked wasn't easy. thick clay soil that cracked in the summer and clung to your boots in the rain. It didn't forgive mistakes. It didn't reward shortcuts. But Samuel understood it. More than that, he respected it. He was a quiet man, much like his son would become. The kind who didn't waste words explaining things you could learn by paying attention. And Caleb learned early. He learned how to read the sky before a storm, how to feel the ground beneath his feet, and know when it was ready. And most of all, he learned machines, not from books, from listening. Samuel had a way of fixing things that didn't make sense to other people. Engines others had given up on. Tools left rusting in barns. He'd bring them back piece by piece, as if he could hear something inside them no one else could. Machines don't lie, he used to say. If something's wrong, they'll tell you. You just have to know how to listen. And Caleb listened for years. By the time he was 12, he could take apart a carburetor blindfolded. By 15, he was repairing engines for neighbors who had twice his experience and half his patience. But the thing he loved most was the Farmall. It wasn't new even back then. Samuel had bought it used from a man 2 counties over. Said it had good bones, whatever that meant. Most people saw an old tractor that would last a few more seasons maybe. Samuel saw something else, and over the years, he changed things, small things at first. Adjustments no one noticed, parts swapped out quietly, reinforcements where they weren't expected. He never explained it fully, not even to Caleb, but sometimes late at night when the barn was quiet and the air smelled like oil and iron, he'd let Caleb watch. Not everything worth knowing needs to be talked about, he said, once tightening a bolt deep inside the engine housing. Something you earn by staying long enough to see what holds. And Caleb stayed, long after other boys left, long after the world started moving faster than their little stretch of land. Because to him, that tractor wasn't just a machine. It was a language, a history, a promise. And years later, when everything else began to change, it would become something more, something nobody. Not the railroad, not Richard Hale, not the crowd gathering on that cold October morning could possibly understand. At least, not yet. The trouble didn't begin that morning on the tracks. It had been building, quietly, for months, maybe even years. The first letter came in late spring, typed. Cold. Official. Midland Rail Expansion. Notice. Caleb had read it once, then set it down on the kitchen table beside a chipped coffee mug that hadn't moved in years. No anger, no reaction, just silence. Because the land they were talking about wasn't just land. It was the lower field, the one closest to the tracks, the one Samuel had spent 3 full summers draining by hand because no machine back then could handle the soil. The one where the ground held water just long enough to grow something most farmers in the county said was impossible. And the one place his father had told him never to sell. Some ground Samuel once said, standing at the edge of that field as the sun went down, looks ordinary until the day it doesn't. Caleb never forgot that, and when the second letter came, he already knew how it would end. Midland didn't want part of the land. They wanted all of it that touched the rail line, because expansion wasn't about need. It was about straight lines on a map drawn by people who had never set foot in the dirt. They marked it clean, efficient, and wrong. Caleb didn't respond, didn't call, didn't argue, because men like him didn't fight with paper. They waited, but there was something else, something no one in that company could have known. And it had nothing to do with stubbornness. It had to do with what was buried beneath that soil. And what had been built into that tractor over years, no one was watching. By midsummer, the survey crew showed up. Bright vests, clean boots, instruments set up like they were measuring something permanent. They hammered stakes into the ground, right through the edges of Caleb's field. One of them, a young man barely out of school, had the nerve to smile when Caleb walked past. "Won't be long now," he said casually, as if talking about the weather. Caleb stopped, looked at the stake, then at the man. "You ever worked soil like this?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Dirt's dirt." Caleb held his gaze for a second longer than comfortable, then nodded once and kept walking. Because there are some answers You don't waste breath correcting. By August, the machines arrived. Not to build, not yet. Just to prepare. Bulldozers parked along the roadside like a warning. Steel tracks. Fresh paint. Power that came from factories, not fields. And that was when the town started talking. At the diner, at the feed store, at the edge of fences where conversations always lingered longer than they should. Turner's gonna lose that land. He should have sold when they offered. Ain't no fighting a railroad. And every time his name came up, it came with a quiet kind of pity, like he was already gone. Just hadn't left yet. But what none of them knew was that Caleb wasn't waiting to lose. He was waiting for something else. Because this story was never really about a man refusing to leave. It was about a man who understood something no one else had even thought to look for. And it started year. The summer his father died. It wasn't dramatic. No accident. No storm. Just a slow fading like a machine that had run too long without rest. On the last night, Samuel called Caleb into the barn. The same barn where that Farmall had spent most of its life. The air smelled like oil hay and something older. Something permanent. Samuel didn't speak right away. He just sat on an overturned bucket, looking at the tractor, then finally said, "Bring me the wrench from the back shelf." Caleb did. And for the mid-hour, they worked, not fixing something broken, adding something deep inside the engine housing. Samuel's hands were slower than they used to be, but still precise, still certain. "What are we doing?" Caleb asked once. Samuel didn't look up. "Finishing something I should have finished years ago." That was all he said. No explanation, no diagram, just a quiet, deliberate series of changes that didn't make sense, unless you understood why they mattered. And Caleb didn't, not fully, not then, but he remembered every movement, every bolt, every adjustment, because that's what he had been taught to do. Watch, learn, wait. When they were done, Samuel wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back slightly. "That machine," he said slowly, "isn't like the others." Caleb frowned. "It's just a Farmall." Samuel shook his head. "No," he said. "It looks like one." A long pause. Then he added something Caleb wouldn't understand until many years later. "One day, something's going to try and move you." He finally looked up. "And when it does, don't try to outshout it." His eyes drifted back to the tractor. "Just make sure it can't move you." That was the last real conversation they ever had. Samuel passed 2 days later, and from that moment on, the Farmall wasn't just a machine Caleb used. It was something he protected, maintained, refined, quietly, over years. Small adjustments, careful listening, learning not just how it worked, but what it could do. And more importantly, what it could hold. So when Midland Rail came with their letters and their deadlines, Caleb didn't panic, because he remembered something no one else did, something buried in memory, and metal, and time. But still, he waited until the day they stepped onto his land and decided it was already theirs. That morning, when the stakes went deeper, when the machines lined up, when the man in the clean coat stood on his soil and told him it was over, that was the moment Caleb knew. Not because of anger, not because of pride, but because the time his father spoke of had finally come. And what happened next wasn't planned the way people think. It was inevitable. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Caleb walked into the barn, ran his hand along the side of the Farmall, felt the cold metal beneath his fingers, listened, not with his ears, but the way his father taught him. Then he climbed up into the seat, turned the ignition, and the engine came to life. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, deep, like something that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He drove it out slowly, past the fence, across the lower field, toward the tracks, toward the line they had already decided to redraw. And without hesitation, he turned the wheel, lined it up, and parked it squarely across the steel, engine still running, as if it had always belonged there, as if it had been waiting for this exact place, at this exact time. And somewhere in the distance, a train horn began to sound. Long, loud, certain, the kind of sound that had never been stopped before. But that morning, for the first time, it was going to be. And the reason why was something nobody out there yet understood. Not the railroad, not the crowd, not even the man standing just feet away, preparing to prove him wrong. Because what they were about to learn had been built piece by piece. Over a lifetime of silence, the chain tightened. Steel links pulled taut between the massive Caterpillar bulldozer and the front axle of the Farmall. The crowd had grown thicker now. Word had spread beyond Boone County. Pickup trucks lined the dirt road. Men leaned against fences. Women stood with arms folded, eyes narrowed against the morning sun. No one laughed anymore. Not fully, because something about the way Caleb sat there hadn't changed. Not when the train stopped. Not when the police arrived. Not when Richard Hale raised his voice loud enough for the cameras. And not now, when real power had finally shown up. Hale stepped forward again, coat-pressed boots still clean, despite the dust. "This is your last chance," he said, his tone no longer amused, but sharp. "You move that tractor now, or we move it for you." A pause, just enough for Caleb to respond. But he didn't. He just reached down and adjusted the throttle slightly. A small movement. So small most people didn't even notice, but the engine did. It deepened, not louder, just heavier, like something settling into itself. And for the first time, a few men in the crowd exchanged looks, because that sound didn't match what they thought they were looking at. But Richard Hale didn't hear it, or maybe he chose not to. He turned to the bulldozer operator and gave a short, confident nod. "Pull it." The engine of the Caterpillar roared to life, loud, aggressive, certain. Tracks dug into the dirt. The chain snapped tight, and for a moment, everything held its breath. Then the bulldozer pushed forward, steel against soil, power against weight, and the Farmall didn't move, not an inch. The bulldozer operator frowned, leaned into the controls, gave it more throttle. The engine screamed louder. Tracks churned deeper into the earth, throwing dirt behind them. The chain strained, metal groaned, and still, nothing. The Farmall sat exactly where it had been, calm, unbothered, unmoved. A murmur ran through the crowd, low at first, then louder. "Why ain't it moving? That thing should have slid already." Hale's jaw tightened. "More power," he snapped. The operator obeyed. The bulldozer surged again, harder this time. The chain jerked violently. The entire machine shook, and then something gave. But not what anyone expected. The bulldozer's tracks spun out, grinding, slipping, digging deeper into the dirt beneath it, but going nowhere. The Farmall didn't resist. It didn't strain. It didn't fight. It simply stayed. And that was the moment. Everything changed, because people stopped seeing an old tractor and started seeing something they couldn't explain. Hale stepped closer now, eyes narrowing, confusion creeping in, where certainty used to live. "That's not possible," he muttered. But it was. And Caleb still hadn't even looked at him. Then slowly, Caleb reached down and pushed the throttle forward. The engine responded immediately, that deep, steady hum turning into something fuller, stronger, like it had been waiting. And then he let out the clutch. What happened next was the part nobody in Boone County ever forgot. The chain tightened again, but this time it moved the other way, slowly at first, almost imperceptible, then unmistakably. The Farmall pulled, not violently, not dramatically, but with a quiet, relentless force that didn't ask permission. The bulldozer lurched, just a fraction, then another. The operator's eyes widened as he fought the controls, but the tracks only spun harder, useless, power without grip, noise without direction, and the Farmall kept going, steady, certain, pulling thousands of pounds of modern machinery backwards, across ground it had never been designed to conquer. The crowd fell completely silent. No laughter, no whispers, just the sound of two machines, and the undeniable truth unfolding in front of them. Richard Hale took a step back, then another, as if distance could help him understand what he was seeing. But there was nothing to understand in the way he wanted, because this wasn't about horsepower, or new versus old, or progress versus tradition. This was something else, something built quietly, over years, hidden in plain sight. The chain finally slackened as the bulldozer lost its footing completely. The engine whined, then stalled, dead silence. And in that silence, the Farmall idled, unshaken, untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. Caleb eased the throttle back. The engine settled, and for the first time since that morning, he looked at Richard Hale, not with anger, not with pride, but with something far heavier. Understanding. The kind that doesn't need words. Hale opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because whatever he had prepared to say didn't belong in this moment anymore. And deep down, he knew it, because what he had just witnessed wasn't something money could fix, or argue with, or dismiss. It was something older, stronger, and completely outside his world. The deputies didn't move. The reporters didn't write. Even the wind seemed to hold back, because everyone there knew they had just seen something they would spend years trying to explain, but never fully could. And the truth, the real truth behind it all, was something only Caleb Turner understood, because this had never been about overpowering the railroad. It had been about anchoring himself to something they could not take. The land beneath that tractor was different, denser, layered with clay his father had spent decades learning to work with instead of against. The weight of the machine, distributed just right. The modifications inside the engine, not designed for speed, but for torque, for grip, for holding. Samuel hadn't built that machine to win races. He built it to never be moved. And now, for the first time, the world had seen what that meant. By late afternoon, Midland Rail called it, not publicly, not with any admission of defeat, but the orders changed. The equipment pulled back. The survey flags stopped moving forward. And within a week, the route was redrawn, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. You can force land. You can buy silence. You can outspend resistance. But you cannot move something that refuses to move. And everyone who had stood there that morning understood that now, even if they couldn't explain it. Richard Hale left Boone County 2 days later. No announcement, no farewell, just gone. And somewhere along the line the story shifted, not in newspapers, but in the way people told it, at the diner, at the feed store, in quiet conversations that carried more weight than headlines ever could. They tried to move him, and couldn't. The man who had been pitied became something else entirely. Not a hero, not a legend, just someone people stopped underestimating. But what Caleb did after all of it, that was the part that mattered most, because he didn't celebrate, didn't tell the story, didn't correct anyone who got it wrong. The very next morning, he was back in the lower field, the same one they tried to take, driving that same Farmall, turning the soil slowly, like nothing had changed, because to him, nothing had. The land was still there, the machine still worked, and the lesson had never been about winning. It was about knowing what you're standing on, and why. Years later, people would still point toward that stretch of track, tell their version of what happened, add details, exaggerate, forget pieces, but the truth remained simple. On a cold morning in October, a man everyone thought was stuck in the past showed them something they had never seen before. That strength doesn't always look like power, that silence isn't the same as weakness, and that the things people laugh at are sometimes the very things they don't understand. Because in the end, it wasn't the railroad that stopped. It wasn't the machines that failed. It was something far more human than that. It was arrogance, finally meeting something it couldn't move.